The whole issue of overlaps is something that was born, I think, out of the way that the treaty negotiations itself began under the BC Treaty process. Under the old government policy, First Nations at one time went to the government with their evidence in hand to prove that they had Aboriginal title to a certain area of land. Well, First Nations began to object to that. They didn't want to have to prove anything. Essentially, they wanted the government to prove how they got title to their land. And the onus of proof issue was the question. The government then at a deadlock agreed to enter into negotiations without necessarily having to prove who had title or where your land was. But one of the 19 recommendations, it stated clearly that First Nations themselves then, during the treaty negotiation process, would resolve their own overlapping issues with their neighbors. What that did then was to push the discussion about boundaries from what was the beginning of the process now to the very end. It's proven to be a very, very difficult issue because on the one hand, if you're just talking about resource access, there seems to be simpler solutions where we're talking about hunting and fishing and access areas. But if you're talking about core land areas, as I think is coming up in this particular case that you mentioned, then it's going to require a serious bit of negotiations.